Okay, file naming conventions, part 4. This and all of this was talked about in the Linda videos, but they talked about project folders and how it deals with that, and it was a little bit more in depth than what we typically do with our high school students. I don't use project folders. I manually create them using the project folder files that was talked about on Linda in the readiness training. I did that a couple of years. The problem with that is students always forget to change the project, so they end up with widgets inside of their truck folder, or they end up with truck parts inside of a virtual project folder. So I went back to just having them manually create the file structure rather than using project files to create the project folders. Anyhow, you'll want to become familiar with the different work environments in Inventor and the icons and extensions that they use. So at this point, unless you've had prior experience with Inventor, you've just worked at the part level, which the extension on the file is .ipt. And the icon looks like a little cube. As we go through core training, we will learn how to create drawings, assemblies, and presentations. Now the drawing looks like a multi-view sketch, where here's the top view, front view, right view of, and that would actually be an assembly that it's showing. The assembly file looks like cubes stacked together, okay, where you put things together. And the presentation file, the icon, looks like a pointer. So parts, IPT, drawings, IDW, assemblies, IAM, presentations, IPN. How this works, and this is why it's so important for you to create project folders, is an assembly file is worthless without the part files. A presentation file is worthless without the assembly file. A drawing file is worthless without all three of those. So what that means is you have a couple things that we want to do, and although we have moved and renamed things, you will always want to use a project folder before you and set that up before you start building your parts. Always use a unique file name and never rename parts or move them. Okay, what that does inside of Inventor, here's a fully assembled T9 truck. And they get this error that says resolve the link, and what is a kid going to do? It's looking for the wheel, it can't find the wheel. What's a student going to do quickly? They're going to skip it, and it opens it up, and all of a sudden the wheel is missing. So magically the wheel is like behaving like it's there, but it's not. Okay. That's why you want to make sure you do things and name things right ahead of time. Second thing with that list, if you notice when you create a new part or a new assembly, and there's a lot of ways to do that, but at the beginning of each session, what it will do is give the file a generic part name. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4. So what a student will do, they'll start building something, they get stuck, they close the file, they will create a new part again, and it'll go to Part 2. So they're trying to build a widget, and they just start it over, it goes to Part 2, and they'll get halfway done with it, and then the next day they have a new session, and every new session of Inventor starts with a generic file naming of part 1, part 2, part 3. Assembly 1, assembly 2, assembly 3. Okay? So what that means is what we want to do is follow a file naming structure that is consistent. Okay, so give it a unique part name with your 3 initials attached to the end to it. So instead of just calling it part 1, 2, 3, for example, I'm going to have the truck file called passenger section T9 CJC, passenger base T9 CJC. That's my initials of my name. So all those parts have unique file names that also tie them to the project. Now, I also do not name this an Automoblocks folder because we have an Automata project, and that becomes a tongue twister to differentiate between Automata and Automoblocks. So I would rather, and it helps the students out, name the file as T9 truck. It's also important to note, and I tell the students this because they'll just name it thingy, or Mr. Conrad is a bleepity bleep bleep, and those file names show up on my drawing documents. So if they give something an inappropriate name, it's going to show up later, and if they rename things, they're going to have problems, because it's like trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And sometimes they mess things up so badly that they just have to start over. So we do not want you to experience that in training, so maintain your file structure. Couple other things with the assembly, the drawings, and the presentation. They can all have the same project name. They're all called Automata because they have a different file extension at the end of the file. So to keep things very simple, you call it Automata Assembly, IAM, Automata CJC.IDW, Automata CJC.IPN. It's very, very simple that way, and they can have the same name because they're a different file type. There may be times that you'll have different versions of drawings or assemblies, and if that's the case, you might have some sub-assemblies or whatever. So at this point, it is okay to move or rename files, as I showed you in the last video, before you start doing assemblies, drawings, and presentations. However, once you do start with assemblies, drawings, and presentations, then renaming files starts to cause problems. Okay, so it's a good idea to go ahead and rename those files ahead of time using the file naming convention. Also, other things we do, we want to avoid the use of subfolders within a project folder, except for STL files. So STL files, that's the file type where you can export to that stands for stereolithography, where you can export the file to a file that can be 3D printed. There are some 3D printers that will print directly from the part file. However, most printers still out there require an STL file. And other rules: don't use the old versions in My Inventor or in any project folders without your instructor's help. Okay, we can look at what's that is talking about. If I go back to Inventor and go to Open, and you'll see that each version or each project folder, it creates backup versions of files that sometimes if you mess something up, you can recover it. Okay, well, if you go into that file folder, you can see there are some old versions, and they have .001 revision 1, that simple connector, CJC revision 5. It adds a whole bunch of there's a whole bunch of backup versions. In fact, there we can see the problem we have is it's looking for the wheel with that truck, and it's looking for the wheel, and at one time it was named rim, okay, instead of wheel. So anywho, so what you want to stress with your students, if you are just doing a practice activity or doodling, use your practice folder as a practice project folder. So any widgets that are not going into a project, I have them do the practice folder. I guess the only other thing to point out is that in industry, those file names and part names would actually be numbers to identify the part. For example, on your lawnmower, and you open up the manual and you need to figure out what air filter you need to replace, you can go into your manual and it'll be identified by a part number from your manual, and it'll show an exploded view of how to get to that and take it apart. But in the educational setting, numbers do not make sense for us or for our students. So always give your files a unique file name that makes sense for the project. And that's all we've got with file structure part 4.